The wind in Wind Hollow did not blow so much as it scoured. It came screaming down from the jagged peaks of the granite range, stripping the last of the yellow cottonwood leaves from the branches and driving grit into every crack of the clapboard houses huddled in the valley. It was late autumn in the year 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was already hardening itself against the coming freeze. The sky was a bruised purple above the ridge line, heavy with the promise of snow that already dusted the high timber like powdered sugar. The town itself looked as if it were bracing for a blow. Main Street was a rutted scar of frozen mud and horse manure, flanked by false-fronted buildings that leaned inward against the gale. At the center of it all stood the Crow Ranch office, and across the way, the saloon, its yellow lamplight bleeding out onto the boardwalk in a sickly pool. Everything in the valley, from the swaying sign above the livery stable to the flanks of the cattle huddled in the holding pens, bore the same mark, a heavy, dark C burned into wood and hide alike. The Crow brand. It was stamped on the wagons, on the barrels of flour in the general store, and, Hannah Price often thought, it was stamped invisibly on the people, too. Hannah stood in the scullery of the Widow Gable's boarding house, her hands submerged in a basin of water that had gone lukewarm and greasy. It was barely dawn. The window above the sink rattled in its frame, a constant, shivering percussion that set her teeth on edge. She scrubbed a cast-iron skillet with a handful of sand and rough soap, her knuckles raw and cracked, bleeding slightly where the cold had split the skin. Through the thin wall separating the kitchen from the dining room, she could hear the scrape of chairs and the low rumble of men's voices. Ranch hands and drifters were shoveling in biscuits and gravy before riding out to the line camps. "I heard they found sign of a hunting party up near Painted Rock," a voice growled. Sounded like old Jeb, probably begging for a handout or looking to steal a calf. Another voice, younger and sharper. "Cut in. You can't trust a Shoshone, hungry or not. Silas says the only reason we haven't been raided this year is because we got enough rifles to make them think twice. That and the Lord's mercy. The Lord and Silas Crow." The first voice agreed with a dark chuckle. Mostly Crow. Hannah stopped scrubbing. She held her breath, her heart giving a painful, singular thump against her ribs. She stared at the soapy water, watching a bubble drift and pop. The fear in their voices was casual, habitual, a thing worn like a heavy coat. She wanted to shout that the Shoshone were starving, that they had been pushed to the edge of the Badlands where nothing grew. But she stayed small. She learned long ago that survival in Wind Hollow meant silence. She rinsed the skillet, the metal slick and black, and set it on the drain board with a deliberate quietness. At 24, Hannah felt as though she had lived 3 lifetimes, all of them tired. She wiped her hands on her apron and touched the wedding band on her left finger. It was thin gold, scratched and dull. Michael had been dead 2 years now. The town told the story with grim satisfaction. A noble death, defending a cattle drive from a savage ambush in the Red Desert. Hannah knew the story by heart because people repeated it to her whenever they wanted to remind her of her place. The kitchen door creaked open, and Mrs. Gable bustled in, a whirlwind of flour dust and anxiety. "Hannah, we need more coffee out there. And don't look so sour. Mr. Crow might stop by this morning to check the ledger. I am moving as fast as I can," Hannah said, her voice soft. "See that you do. And keep your hair covered. It is looking wild again." Hannah reached up and smoothed the heavy, dark braid pinned severely at the nape of her neck. She knew what Mrs. Gable meant. It was not just untidy. It was too thick, too straight, too black. It was her mother's hair. She picked up the heavy coffee pot and walked into the dining room. The heat of the wood stove hit her face, flushing her pale cheeks. The men did not look up as she filled their cups, their eyes fixed on their plates or the window. To them, she was a fixture of the room, like the sideboard or the stove, only less useful. She was the Widow Price, the woman who owed a debt she could never repay, a charity case that Silas Crow allowed to exist. As she poured, she felt the weight of the debt pressing on her shoulders. Michael had left her nothing but a grave to tend and a stack of gambling markers held by the Crow estate. Silas had paid for the coffin. Silas had paid for the headstone. Silas had absorbed the gambling debts with a benevolent smile that chilled Hannah to the bone. Now, every month, half her wages from the boarding house went to the ranch office. At this rate, she would be free in 40 years. She retreated to the kitchen, the door swinging shut on the conversation. She leaned against the frame for a moment, closing her eyes. "Don't move," she whispered to herself. "Just breathe." She pushed off the wall and went to the small, cramped storage room at the back of the house that served as her quarters. It was freezing, the draft whistling through the floorboards. On the narrow cot, 2 lumps shifted under a pile of quilts. "Time to wake up," she said gently. A tousled head popped up. Tommy, 8 years old and looking too much like his father, rubbed his eyes. "Is it cold?" "Ice on the bucket," Hannah said, crossing the room to the washstand. She broke the thin crust of ice on the pitcher and poured water into the bowl. Emma sat up next, 5 years old, clutching a rag doll with one button eye. She had Hannah's dark eyes and the high cheekbones that hinted at the bloodline they never spoke of. Hannah's heart clenched. She wet a cloth and went to them, scrubbing their faces briskly. "Hurry now, Mrs. Gable wants the wood box filled before school," Hannah said. Tommy shivered as he pulled on his trousers. "I hate school. Billy Miller called me a name yesterday." Hannah froze. "What name?" "He didn't say. He just mumbled. Something about a savage." Hannah gripped the washcloth so tight water dripped onto the floorboards. She knelt in front of Tommy, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me. You ignore them. You keep your head down. You do your sums. And you come straight back here. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded, frightened by her intensity. Hannah smoothed his hair, her fingers trembling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, rough object wrapped in a handkerchief. She unfolded it to reveal a bracelet of smoked deerskin, beaded with patterns of blue and white glass, the colors of the sky and snow. It was old, the leather worn soft. She did not let them wear it. It was too dangerous. But every morning, she showed it to them for a second, a ritual of memory. "Mama made this," she whispered. "She was good, she was kind, and she was from this land before any of them. Never forget that inside, but never speak it outside." She wrapped the bracelet again and hid it beneath the loose floorboard under the cot, the only bank vault she had. Her mother had died of a fever when Hannah was 12, but the town's memory was long. They remembered the woman from the Shoshone camp who had married the white trapper. They remembered the fires. Hannah remembered the names men had called her mother in the street, words that cut deeper than the wind. She would not let those names stick to Tommy and Emma. Sunday service in Wind Hollow was a performance of piety and power. The white clapboard church sat on a rise overlooking the town, its bell tolling a flat, iron note that echoed off the canyon walls. The wind rattled the stained glass, but inside, the air was still and smelled of damp wool, hymnals, and hair oil. Hannah sat in the back pew. Tommy and Emma pressed tightly against her sides. She wore her black morning dress, though it was fraying at the cuffs. She kept her eyes on the back of the pew in front of her, but she could feel the presence of the man in the front row. Silas Crow did not sit. He occupied the space. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of iron filings and eyes that were a piercing, clear gray. He wore a suit of fine black broadcloth that cost more than Hannah would earn in a lifetime. When the collection plate was passed, the clatter of his gold eagle coin against the wood was loud enough to be heard in the loft. After the hymns, which were sung with more grim determination than joy, the Reverend Thomas cleared his throat. He was a thin, anxious man who looked as though the Wyoming wind had eroded him down to the bone. "Brothers and sisters," he began, clutching the pulpit, "we have a guest today, Circuit Rider Jacob from the Valley Mission." A man rose from the side bench. He was dusty, his face lined with exhaustion. He stepped up to the pulpit, twisting a battered hat in his hands. "I bring heavy news," the rider said, his voice raspy. "The mission at Bitter Creek. It is gone. Fire took the main hall 3 days ago. We lost supplies. We lost the roof. And the sickness, diphtheria, it took the elders. A murmur went through the congregation. Hannah felt Emma stiffen beside her and placed a calming hand on the girl's knee. "We have 6 children left," the writer continued. "Orphans, no kin in the territory. We cannot keep them in the ruins with winter coming on so hard. There is an orphanage in Laramie City that will take them, but we have no wagons left, and I am too old to guide them over the pass before the snow closes it for good." The church went silent. Laramie City was on the other side of the Granite Range. To cross the pass this late in the season was a gamble with death. The Reverend looked toward the front pew. "Brother Crow?" Silas Crow stood up slowly. He turned to face the congregation, his expression one of grave concern. The silence stretched, allowing him to hold the room in the palm of his hand. "It is a tragedy," Silas said, his voice deep and smooth like polished oak. "Wind Hollow protects its own, and we protect the innocent. I will provide a wagon. I will provide the horses and the supplies for the journey." Heads nodded in approval. A generous man. A good man. "But," Silas continued, raising a hand, "I cannot spare my own ranch hands. We are mustering the last of the herd before the freeze. We need a driver. Someone who knows the high trails. Someone expendable. Perhaps," he let the word hang in the air. Hannah looked up, catching Silas's profile. There was no kindness in the set of his jaw. He was calculating. He was spending a few sacks of flour to buy the town's adoration, and he was planning something else. She saw his eyes flicker toward the window, toward the mountains. Cold and detached. "I will find a man," Silas promised. "The children will be moved." As the service ended and the townsfolk filed out to shake Silas's hand, Hannah tried to slip away, but the crowd was thick. She found herself pressed near the door just as Silas reached it. He stopped, looking down at her. He smelled of expensive tobacco and bay rum. "Mrs. Price," he said. "Mr. Crow," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "I trust the boarding house is keeping you warm enough. The winter will be hard." "We are fine. Thank you. Good. I would hate to think of you shivering. If you ever need adjustments to our arrangement, my door is open." The implication slid between his words like a knife. Hannah felt a wave of nausea. She nodded once, gripped Tommy's hand, and pushed out into the biting wind, gasping for air as if she had been underwater. The saloon that evening was a cave of smoke and noise. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. In a private booth at the back, shadowed by a heavy velvet curtain, Silas Crow poured amber whiskey into 2 glasses. Opposite him sat Marshal Diller, a man whose gut strained against his vest and whose eyes were perpetually watery. "You are asking for trouble." "Silas," the marshal muttered, wiping foam from his mustache. "Sending that wagon out now? It is 50-50 if they make the pass." "That is the point," Silas said calmly. He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "I don't follow. The children are a burden. If they make it to Laramie, I am the hero who saved them. If they don't, well, it was the Lord's will and the cruelty of winter. I still get the credit for trying. You have a cold heart. Silas." Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his gray eyes. "It takes a cold heart to survive a Wyoming winter. Marshal, but we need a driver. And I have the perfect candidate." "Who?" "Luke Redfern." The marshal choked on his drink, coughing violently. "Redfern? The half-breed?" "He is a drifter. Silas, a killer. He won't do it." "He will," Silas said, leaning forward. "Because he owes me, and because he still thinks he has a soul to save. He is dangerous. He is convenient. He knows the trails better than any white man, and if the wagon goes over a cliff, or if he freezes to death in a drift, then Wind Hollow is rid of a nuisance, a man who remembers things he shouldn't." Silas took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn. "He is riding in from the North Ridge. My boys saw him. He will be here by sundown to trade pelts. You bring him to me." "I don't like it," the marshal grumbled. "You don't have to like it," Silas said softly, his voice dropping to a register that was pure menace. "You just have to do it, unless you want the town to know who really paid for that new roof on your house." The marshal fell silent, staring into his glass. Silas patted him on the shoulder, tossed a silver dollar on the table, and stood up, buttoning his coat against the draft. Luke Redfern rode the ridgeline, a shadow moving against the darkening slate of the sky. The wind up here was a physical blow, tearing at the brim of his hat and whipping the mane of his roan gelding. A sturdy beast named Ghost. Luke didn't feel the cold. Or rather, he felt it, but he acknowledged it as he would a stone in his boot. Something to be endured, not fought. He was 30 years old, but his face was a map of hard country. A jagged white scar ran from his left temple down into his beard, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. His skin was the color of weathered saddle leather, his hair dark and worn long, tied back with a strip of rawhide. He wore a buffalo coat that had seen better decades and a Colt Navy revolver worn low on his hip. He pulled the horse up at the crest of the hill and looked down into the valley. Wind Hollow lay below, a cluster of gray scabs on the land. Smoke rose from the chimneys, instantly snatched away by the gale. Luke hated towns. They smelled of lies and confinement, but he was out of coffee, out of salt, and low on ammunition. He had a bundle of wolf pelts tied behind his saddle that would buy him enough to survive the winter in the high-line cabin he had built near the tree line. He shifted in the saddle, his eyes scanning the valley floor. To the east, hidden by a fold in the earth, lay the charred remains of what had once been a homestead. He didn't look at it, but he saw it anyway. The image was burned into the back of his eyelids. 5 years ago. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He closed his eyes and saw the fire again. It was night, the smell of kerosene and burning flesh, screaming. The Shoshone winter camp, peaceful, asleep. Then the thunder of hooves. He had been scouting for the army then, foolishly believing he could bridge the gap between his father's people and his mother's. He had led the column near the valley, thinking they were there to talk treaty. But the men who rode down on the camp weren't army. They were riders in long dusters, their faces covered. Luke remembered the chaos. He remembered seeing the Crow brand on a panicked horse. He remembered seeing Michael Price, young and terrified, firing a rifle blindly into a tent. Luke had thrown himself off his horse, running into the flames to pull a child out, a little girl with wide, black eyes. A rifle butt had slammed into his skull, dropping him to the blood-soaked snow. When he woke, the camp was ash. The riders were gone. And the town of Wind Hollow had spun a story about a Shoshone uprising that had to be put down. Luke, the half-breed scout, was blamed for leading the hostiles to the slaughter, or for leading the white men. Depending on who told the lie, he was a man without a tribe, marked by both sides. He opened his eyes, the gray reality of the present rushing back. He spat on the frozen ground. "Just get the supplies," he muttered to the horse. "In and out, before the snow flies." He nudged Ghost forward, the horse picking its way down the treacherous scree slope toward the lights of the town. The reception in Wind Hollow was exactly as Luke expected. As he rode down Main Street, the few people braving the wind stopped and stared. A woman sweeping her porch froze, clutching her broom like a weapon, then turned her back sharply. 2 men outside the livery stable stopped talking, their hands drifting instinctively toward their belts. Luke kept his face impassive, his eyes fixed on the ears of his horse. He could feel their hatred. It was a tangible thing, prickly and hot. To them, he was a mongrel, a reminder of the violence they pretended didn't happen. Or worse, a scapegoat for their own sins. He tied Ghost to the rail outside the trading post. As he loosened the cinch to check the saddle, a movement caught his eye. A boy, no older than 10, stood by the alley mouth. The boy's face was twisted in a scowl that looked borrowed from a much older man. "Get out of here, Injun!" the boy shouted. Luke didn't look up. He adjusted the strap. "I said get out!" A stone the size of a hen's egg whizzed through the air. It struck Ghost on the flank. The horse reared, letting out a sharp whinny of surprise. Luke grabbed the bridle, soothing the animal with a low murmur in the Shoshone tongue, his hand firm on the velvet nose. "Easy, brother, easy." He turned slowly to look at the boy. Luke didn't speak. He just looked, his dark eyes empty and hard. The boy faltered, taking a step back. A woman rushed out of the store, grabbing the boy by the collar. "You get away from him." "Jimmy, don't you go near that trash. He's liable to scalp you as soon as look at you." She dragged the boy away, casting a fearful, hateful glance over her shoulder. Luke watched them go. His jaw tightened until the muscles ached, but he showed nothing else. He patted Ghost's neck one last time, unhooked his pelts, and walked into the store, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt obscene. By evening, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that was heavy and expecting snow. Inside the boarding house kitchen, the dinner rush was over. Hannah was wiping down the drain board, her back aching. The house was quiet for once. She blew out the lantern to save oil and stood in the darkness, looking out the window that faced the back alley and the livery yard beyond. The moon was rising, pale and distant, casting long, blue shadows across the frosted ground. A figure moved near the water trough. A man. He was tall, wearing a heavy buffalo coat. He was breaking the ice on the trough with the butt of a rifle, the sound sharp in the still air. Hannah froze. She knew that coat. She knew the way he moved, fluid, careful, like a wolf circling a trap. Luke Redfern. Her breath hitched. She hadn't seen him in 3 years. Not since the inquiry into Michael's death, where he had stood in the back of the room, silent and bruised, while the town council declared Michael a hero and Luke a suspect who couldn't be charged for lack of evidence. The anger flared in her, hot and sudden. This was the man who had led the party. This was the man who, they said, had signaled the ambush that killed her husband. She should pull the curtain. She should turn away. Instead, she opened the back door. She told herself she needed to empty the slop bucket. She picked up the heavy pail of potato peelings and dishwater and stepped out onto the small porch. The cold bit through her thin dress instantly. She walked to the edge of the yard to dump the pail into the hog pen. The sound of the splashing water made the man at the trough look up. Luke turned. He had a bucket of water in one hand for his horse. He saw her standing there, framed by the moonlight and the steam rising from the slop. He went still. Hannah stared at him. She saw the scar on his face, silver in the moonlight. She saw the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. She waited for the hate to rise up and choke her, the hate she was supposed to feel for the half-breed who widowed her. But what she felt was a strange, vibrating shock. Luke looked at her. He recognized her instantly. The widow Price. The girl with the Shoshone mother who tried so hard to be white. He remembered seeing her at the hearing, her face pale and wet with tears, holding a black hat in her hands. He remembered wanting to tell her the truth then, that her husband hadn't been a hero, that he had been a butcher, but looking at her grief, he hadn't been able to do it. He saw her eyes now. They were dark, terrified, and defiant. Neither of them moved. The wind picked up again, swirling snow dust around their boots. They were two ghosts haunting the same graveyard, bound by a lie that lay between them like a canyon. Luke touched the brim of his hat. It was a small, almost involuntary gesture of respect. Hannah didn't move. She didn't speak. She just gripped the handle of the bucket until her knuckles turned white, staring at him as if trying to read a language she had forgotten. Then, the back door of the saloon kicked open 50 yards away, and the sound of a piano spilled out, shattering the moment. Luke turned back to his horse, swinging into the saddle in one smooth motion. Hannah turned on her heel and bolted back inside the kitchen, slamming the door and leaning against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the first real flakes of the blizzard began to fall, silent and burying. The nave of the church was colder than the air outside. The wood stove in the corner hissed and popped, fighting a losing battle against the draft that whistled through the gaps in the clapboard walls. It was Tuesday evening, and the emergency meeting called by Reverend Thomas had drawn nearly every able-bodied soul in Wind Hollow, though few looked happy to be there. They sat in their heavy coats, hats held in laps, faces pinched with the skepticism that comes from living in a land that gives nothing for free. Hannah sat near the back again, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Beside her, Mrs. Gable sniffed loudly, disapproval radiating from her like heat from a stove. The circuit rider, Jacob, stood by the altar, looking even more haggard than he had on Sunday. "We have the wagon," the Reverend said, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Mr. Crow has provided a sturdy buckboard and a team of mules, along with 2 spare horses. We have the supplies. The Lord has provided the means. Now, we need the man." He looked out over the congregation, silence stretched tight as a drum skin. To cross the Granite Range in late November was not merely difficult. It was a fool's errand. The passes were treacherous, the trails obscured by drifts, and the wolves were hungry. No ranch hand or town shopkeeper was willing to risk their life for a handful of strangers' children. "I will pay $50. Silas Crow's voice cut through the silence. He stood near the front, immaculate in his dark suit, a contrast to the rough wool and canvas around him. He turned, scanning the room with that gray, predatory gaze. $50 to the man who guides this wagon to Laramie City. A murmur went through the room. $50 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a small herd or drink for a year. Yet, feet shuffled and eyes looked down at boots. Money was no use to a corpse frozen in a snowbank. Silas sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. "It seems we are short on courage in Wind Hollow, or perhaps just short on charity." He let the insult land, then turned his eyes toward the shadowy corner near the door where the marshal stood. Beside the marshal, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a look of utter boredom on his face, was Luke Redfern. He had been detained on a trumped-up charge of disturbing the peace after the incident with the boy and the stone. A convenient way to keep him in town until this moment. "Perhaps," Silas said, raising his voice, "we should look to those who know the land best. Those who claim to be of the land." The heads turned. Luke did not move, but his jaw tightened. "Mr. Redfern," Silas said, smiling pleasantly, "you are heading out, are you not? You have no family here, no job, and you know the high passes better than any white man in the territory." Luke pushed off the wall. The chains on his spurs clinked. A sharp sound in the quiet room. "I am not a guide. Crow, and I am not a suicide. That pass is closed. It is not closed until the snow is 10 feet deep," Silas countered. "And $50 would buy you a lot of distance from this town. I don't want your money." Silas walked slowly down the aisle, stopping a few feet from Luke. He lowered his voice, though in the silence, it carried clearly to Hannah's ears. "Then consider it payment for past debts. Or consider it a way to ensure you actually leave this town alive. The marshal tells me people are very upset about you threatening that boy yesterday. Mobs can be unpredictable. It would be a shame if you didn't make it out of the valley at all." Luke stared at him, his dark eyes unreadable. He knew the threat was real. Silas could snap his fingers, and Luke would be hanging from a cottonwood before morning, with the marshal holding the rope. It was a choice between the blizzard and the noose. "I will take the wagon," Luke said, his voice flat and cold. "But I leave at first light, and I take the supplies I want." "Done," Silas said, clapping his hands together. "A true Christian act. Mr. Redfern." The tension in the room broke, replaced by relief. The town wouldn't have to sacrifice one of their own. They could send the half-breed. If he died, well, it was the way of things. Hannah felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She looked toward the front, where the circuit rider was nodding gratefully. "Who will care for the children?" Hannah asked. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood up, her knees shaking. "Mr. Redfern can drive the wagon," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But he cannot care for 6 children. Not on that road. They need a woman. They need someone to cook and keep them warm. Mrs. Price," the Reverend said gently. "It is too dangerous. I know the danger," Hannah said. "But I heard you say the youngest is 3 years old. A 3-year-old cannot survive that trip with just a driver. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with a curious expression, like a cat watching a mouse that had unexpectedly bitten back. "I'm going," Hannah stated. "I will take Tommy and Emma. We will go to Laramie?" "Hannah, Mrs." Gable hissed, tugging at her skirt. "You have your job here. You have your debt. I have nothing here," Hannah said, pulling her skirt free. She looked directly at Silas. "Nothing but a debt I can never pay and a grave I cannot bring back. I am going." Silas studied her. Hannah saw the calculation behind his eyes. If she left, she might die. If she died, the debt was written off, but he would lose the leverage he enjoyed holding over her. But if she stayed, her stubbornness might become a problem. And there was something else. Sending the widow Price on a mission of mercy made him look even more benevolent. "Let her go," Silas said softly. "Mrs. Price has a noble heart. Who are we to stand in the way of such charity? We will pause the interest on your debt. Hannah, consider it my contribution." It was settled. Hannah sat down, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. She was leaving. She was taking Tommy and Emma and leaving this valley of ghosts. The introduction happened in the church doorway as the meeting dispersed. The wind howls were picking up outside, rattling the heavy oak doors. Silas stood like a proprietor, gesturing for Luke to approach Hannah. Luke walked over, his movement stiff. Up close, Hannah saw the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the white ridge of the scar that vanished into his beard. He smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and the sagebrush of the high plains. "Mrs. Price," Silas said, his hand resting possessively on the doorframe. "This is Luke Redfern. He will be your protector for the journey." Luke extended a hand. It was rough, calloused, and large. Hannah hesitated, then reached out. When her skin touched his, she felt a strange, jarring sensation, like touching a static-charged blanket in the dry winter air. His grip was firm but brief. "Ma'am," Luke said. "Mr. Redfern," Hannah replied. Her voice was cool, guarded. She looked up into his face and saw it, the shape of the eyes, the high set of the cheekbones. It was her mother's face, hardened and scarred and set on a man's frame. The recognition was a physical pang. He was of the people she had denied. Luke looked at her, and she saw the realization dawn in him too. He looked at her not as the white widow of a rancher, but as something else. He saw the black hair she tried so hard to pin back. He saw the shadow of the Shoshone girl who had run from the burning homestead. "It will be a hard ride," Luke said, his voice low. "If you are doing this, be ready at dawn. I don't wait for lagging. I know how to work, Mr. Redfern. I won't hold you up. Good, because the snow doesn't care about your good intentions." He turned and walked out into the night without looking back at Silas. Hannah watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of fear and kinship. She was entrusting her life, and the lives of her siblings, to a man her husband had hunted. And yet, looking at Silas Crow's smiling face, she knew the man walking into the dark was the safer choice. The morning of the departure was gray and bitter. The sky was a flat sheet of steel, pressing down on the valley. In front of the livery stable, the wagon stood loaded. It was a sturdy freighter, canvas stretched over hoop frames, the wheels greased and heavy. The reality of Western travel was not romantic. It was a matter of weight and survival. Hannah watched as Luke lashed barrels to the sideboards. There were 200 pounds of flour, a sack of navy beans, a side of salt pork, and a keg of molasses. Luke was checking the hooves of the led mule, his movements efficient and critical. He straightened up as Silas approached, looking fresh and rested in his fur-colored coat. "You are light on feed," Luke said, gesturing to the grain sacks. "If we get stuck, the horses starve first. You will be in Laramie in 6 days," Silas said dismissively. "The pass is open." Luke looked at the sky. The wind was coming from the north, smelling of ozone and ice. "It is turning. Crow. We should wait 2 days. Let this front blow through. And let the children freeze in the church basement?" Silas shook his head. "You leave today. The pass will hold another week. I have cattle in the high pasture. I know the signs." Luke spat on the ground, missing Silas's polished boot by an inch. You know money, crow. You don't know the mountain. Silas's eyes narrowed, the pleasant mask slipping for a second. Just drive the wagon. Redfern? Hannah climbed onto the wagon seat, pulling Tommy and Emma up behind her. Inside the canvas cover, 4 other children huddled on bedrolls. There was Caleb, a sullen boy of 12 with hair like straw. Sarah, 8 years old and silent, and 2 small brothers, Jeremiah and Sam, 5 and 3, who clung to each other like frightened puppies. Hannah tucked a heavy buffalo robe around her legs. She wore her husband's old duster over her coat and a wool scarf wrapped twice around her head. She looked at the town, the gray buildings, the mud, the staring faces of the people who had pitied her but never loved her. Luke mounted his horse, Ghost, and tied the lead rope of the spare horses to the wagon's rear gate. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, he just whistled to the mule team. A sharp, piercing sound. Hiya! The wagon lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding in the frozen mud. Hannah grabbed the bench rail. As they rolled past the boarding house, she saw Mrs. Gable watching from the window. Hannah didn't wave. They passed the edge of town, the buildings giving way to sagebrush and scrub oak. The wind hit them harder here, unobstructed by walls. Hannah looked back one last time. Wind Hollow looked small, insignificant, a smudge of soot on a vast, white canvas. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach, tight and cold, but beneath it was a release so profound it made her dizzy. She was free. The first 3 days were a brutal education in the indifference of the landscape. The trail wound upward, following the curve of the river before cutting sharply toward the foothills. The ground was hard as iron, jarring the wagon with every rotation of the wheels. Luke rode ahead, a solitary figure scouting the drifts. He spoke little. When he did, it was to give orders. Walk the horses here, brake hard, get the children out. It is too steep. Hannah learned quickly. She learned that her hands, already rough, could bleed and blister and still grip the reins. She learned that unhitching a mule team in freezing wind required a kind of numbness she had to summon from within. On the second evening, they camped in a grove of aspen. The wind had died down, but the cold was intense. Luke set up a picket line for the horses while Hannah gathered dry wood. You are holding the axe wrong. Luke's voice came from the dark. Hannah jumped, nearly dropping the hatchet. I am managing. He stepped into the firelight. He didn't mock her. He reached out and took the axe, his fingers brushing her glove. You are choking the handle. You'll break your wrist when you strike hard wood. Hold it loose. Let the weight do the work. He demonstrated, a fluid swing that split a log cleanly. He handed the axe back. Try. Hannah swung. It was better. Again. He watched her for 10 minutes, correcting her stance, his voice low and patient. There was no condescension in it, only the practical economy of a man who knew that incompetence could get them all killed. Thank you, she said, breathless, her breath pluming in the air. Luke nodded and turned away to check the horses. It unsettled her. She was used to men who either ignored her or tried to charm her. She wasn't used to a man who simply saw a task and helped her perform it. Later, around the fire, the children sat wrapped in blankets, eating the beans and hardtack Hannah had prepared. The food was bland and heavy, but it was hot. Hannah sat with Emma on her lap, listening as the orphans talked. My PA was a miner, Caleb said, poking the fire with a stick. He died in the Silver Star collapse. Ma died of the lung fever last winter. My daddy got shot, little Jeremiah chirped up, his eyes wide, in a card game. Hannah's heart twisted. They were a wagon full of broken pieces. What about him? Caleb whispered, nodding toward the edge of the firelight where Luke sat on a log, whittling a piece of cedar. He didn't sit with them. He ate his portion quickly and retreated to the shadows, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. What about Mr. Redfern? Hannah asked softly. He's an Injun, Caleb said, using the slur with casual familiarity. Billy at the orphanage said they scalp kids. Said they eat dogs. Hush, Hannah snapped, the word coming out sharper than she intended. She looked quickly at Luke. He hadn't moved, but his hand had paused on the wood he was carving. He had heard, "We do not use those words," Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Redfern is guiding us. He is saving your life. Caleb, you will show respect." Caleb scowled, looking down. "My PA said the only good one is a dead one." "Your PA isn't here driving this wagon," Hannah said firmly. She looked back at Luke. He had resumed whittling, the knife curling long strips of wood away. He seemed carved from stone himself, impervious to the words of a 12-year-old boy. But Hannah felt the sting of it. She remembered her own mother, shrinking away when shopkeepers spoke to her like she was a slow-witted child. She felt the shame of her own silence all those years. The fourth day, the sky betrayed them. It started with a change in the light. The gray deepened to a bruised purple, and the wind shifted, coming from the north with a sound like a shriek. The temperature plummeted so fast Hannah could feel the air hardening in her lungs. "Storm!" Luke shouted. Riding back to the wagon, he looked wild, his scarf pulled up over his nose, his horse dancing sideways. "It's coming down fast. We need to make the ridge." "We can't stop here," Hannah yelled over the wind. "No shelter. The valley channels the wind." "We'll be buried. There is a line cabin 3 miles up, near the old mining claim. We have to push." He tied his horse to the back of the wagon and climbed onto the bench beside her, taking the reins. "Get inside with the children. Keep them under the buffalo robes. Do not let them sleep." Hannah scrambled back into the canvas-covered bed. The children were huddled in a pile, crying softly. "It's all right," she lied, her teeth chattering. "We are just going to a house, a warm house." The storm hit them with the force of a hammer. The world vanished in a swirl of white. The wagon groaned, the wood creaking under the strain as Luke whipped the mules forward. The snow wasn't falling. It was driving horizontally, stinging like buckshot. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its meaning in the whiteout. The wagon lurched violently, slipping sideways. Hannah heard Luke shouting, cursing the mules, his voice raw against the gale. Suddenly, the wagon stopped. "Out!" Luke yelled, ripping the canvas flap open. Snow swirled into the small space. "We can't make the incline with the weight. We have to walk." Hannah grabbed Emma. Caleb took Jeremiah. They tumbled out into the snow. It was thigh-deep already. The wind knocked Hannah breathless. She couldn't see 5 feet in front of her. "Follow the horse," Luke roared. He had unhitched the mules and was leading them by the bridles, breaking a trail. They fought their way up the slope. It was a nightmare of stumbling, falling, and dragging the weeping children. Hannah's legs burned. Her hands were numb blocks of ice. She fell once, dropping Emma into a drift. Panic surged, hot and bright, but a hand grabbed her coat collar and hauled her up. Luke was there, his face caked in ice. "Move, Hannah. Move or you die." They saw the cabin only when they were 10 feet from it. It was a low, squat structure of rough logs, half buried in a drift, looking more like a pile of debris than a shelter. Luke kicked the door. It was frozen shut. He threw his shoulder against it. Once, twice. It gave with a shriek of rusted hinges. Inside, they tumbled into the dark. The air inside was freezing, smelling of rat droppings and ancient dust. But the wind was gone. Luke slammed the door and jammed a piece of broken wood into the latch. "Don't sit down," he ordered. "If you stop moving, the frostbite sets in. Hannah, find wood. Anything." The cabin was a wreck. A broken bunk lay in the corner. A rusted potbelly stove sat in the center. Hannah frantically began tearing planks from the ruined bunk, her fingers clumsy and useless. Luke produced a lucifer match, shielding the tiny flame with his body as he coaxed a nest of dry moss and splinters to life inside the stove. When the fire finally caught, a smoky, fitful orange glow lit the room. They huddled around it, shaking violently. "It is not enough," Luke said, looking at the small pile of wood. "That won't last the night. And the walls?" He gestured to the gaps between the logs where snow hissed through. "This place is a sieve. We have the blankets," Hannah said, her teeth clicking together. We have 3 blankets, Luke corrected, and 8 people. He looked at the 2 remaining cots. They were narrow. Canvas stretched over wood frames. Push them together, he commanded, near the stove. He grabbed the cots and shoved them side by side, everyone on the bed. Now, Hannah hesitated. The proprieties of Wind Hollow were etched deep in her bones. To sleep in a heap, unmarried men and women. Do you want to be proper? Or do you want to be alive? Luke asked, seeing her hesitation. Look at the boy. He pointed to little Sam. The child's lips were blue, his eyes drooping shut. Hannah nodded. She swallowed her shame and climbed onto the cots. Children in the middle. Luke directed. Caleb, you take the far side. Hannah, next to the little ones. They arranged themselves. The children were a shivering mass of limbs. Hannah lay on her side, curling her body around Emma and Sam. Luke stood by the stove for a moment, feeding the last large piece of wood into the fire. Then he blew out the lantern to save oil. The darkness was absolute, save for the red eye of the stove vent. Luke lay down on the edge of the cot, behind Hannah. There was 1 heavy wool blanket from the wagon, stiff with frozen sleet, and 2 thinner ones. Luke spread the heavy one over the group, tucking the edges in tight. The cold from the floor seeped up through the canvas. The fire began to die down, the wind outside screaming like a banshee, shaking the cabin to its foundations. Hannah felt the cold creeping along her back. She shivered, a convulsive spasm she couldn't control. Luke shifted. The cot creaked. He moved closer. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the solid, heavy presence of his body against her back. He was wearing his buffalo coat, and the coarse fur pressed against her shoulder. Move back, he whispered. Hannah stiffened. I can't. You are freezing, he said, his voice a rough vibration against her ear. And you are letting the cold get to the girl. He was right. Emma was shivering in her arms. Luke didn't wait for permission. He shifted his body until his chest was pressed against Hannah's back. He threw his heavy arm over her waist, pulling her and the children tighter into a single, solid mass. Hannah gasped. The contact was shocking. She could feel the hard muscle of his arm, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. It was improper. It was scandalous. And it was warm. His body heat was a furnace. It soaked through her coat, through her dress, chasing the ice from her spine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Loud enough, she feared, for him to hear. The wind rattled the door, a sudden violent gust that threatened to tear it from its hinges. The fire popped and dimmed. Luke's arm tightened instinctively, holding her fast against the thread of the dark. His hand rested on her stomach, just above her hip. It was a protective gesture, the way a man holds on to something he is afraid of losing in a storm. Hannah lay there, caught in the suspension between survival and something else. She could smell him, leather and sage and the sweat of hard labor. Her breathing synchronized with his. She felt him shift slightly, his head dipping near her neck as he tried to get comfortable on the narrow rim of the cot. His breath ghosted over her skin, warm and alive. A strange, sharp ache bloomed in her stomach. Lower than the fear, it was a pull, a gravity she hadn't felt since Michael died. And even then, never this fierce. This was raw. It was the desire of the living to cling to the living. She felt Luke tense, as if he suddenly realized exactly where his hand was, exactly how her body fit against his. He started to pull his arm back, a fraction of an inch, a retreat to propriety. The cold air rushed into the gap immediately. "Don't move," Hannah whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. Luke froze. "You'll wake them?" she added quickly, nodding her chin toward the sleeping children. It was a lie. The children were exhausted, dead to the world, but it was the only permission she could give. Luke hesitated. Then, slowly, he settled back. He pulled her tight again, his arm heavy and anchoring. "I won't move," he breathed, beneath a heavy, frozen blanket, under the roar of the Wyoming wind. They lay together. Hannah closed her eyes, feeling the heat of him seep into her bones, terrifying and wonderful. While the storm buried the world outside, The dawn did not break so much as it bled into the cabin, a gray, joyless light filtering through the cracks in the logs. The fire had died down to a bed of sullen red coals, offering little heat against the morning freeze that had settled over the valley. Hannah woke slowly, pulling herself up from the depths of a heavy, exhausted sleep. For a moment, she did not know where she was. She felt warmth along her back, a solid, rhythmic pressure that rose and fell with a steady breath. Her own hand was resting on a rough wool sleeve. Her fingers curled into the fabric. Memory returned with a jolt. She froze. She was pressed against Luke Redfern, her body spooned against his, sheltered by the bulk of his frame and the heavy buffalo coat. The shame hit her instantly, hot and sharp, warring with a lingering sense of safety she had not felt in years. She had slept, for the first time since Michael died. She had slept without the gnawing fear of the future keeping her eyes open. She shifted carefully, trying to pull away without waking him. But as she moved, Luke tensed. He did not jump or startle. He simply went from asleep to awake in the span of a heartbeat, a reflex born of years sleeping with one eye open on the trail. He rolled away from her immediately. Sitting up on the edge of the cot, the cold air rushed into the space between them, reclaiming the territory their bodies had held. Luke rubbed his face with his hands, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He did not look at her. "Morning," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," Hannah whispered. She sat up, straightening her skirts and smoothing her hair, her face burning. She looked toward the children. They were still a tangle of limbs, sleeping deeply in the burrow of warmth they had created. Neither Hannah nor Luke spoke of the night, the memory of his arm around her waist, of the way their breathing had synchronized in the dark, hung in the air like smoke, unspoken and heavy. Luke stood and walked to the stove, clattering the iron door loudly as if to chase the quiet away. He fed the last of their kindling into the grate. "Get them up," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "The storm is broke. We need to move." Hannah nodded, grateful for the command. It gave her something to do with her hands. She woke the children gently, soothing their groans of protest as they crawled out from the blankets into the biting cold. Outside, the world had been erased. The familiar landmarks of the valley, the scrub oak, the rocky outcrops, the winding creek bed, were gone, buried under 3 feet of fresh, white powder. The sky was a pale, hard blue, stripped of clouds but promising no warmth. The wind had sculpted the snow into waves that looked like a frozen ocean. Luke stood by the wagon, which was buried up to the axles. He was studying the horizon. His eyes narrowed against the glare. "The trail is gone," Hannah said, coming to stand beside him. She felt a surge of panic. "How do we know where the road is?" "We don't," Luke said. "The drifts are too deep in the bottom. If we try to follow the creek road, we will lose the mules. They will flounder and break a leg. Then what do we do? Go back? No going back. The pass behind us will be worse." Luke pointed a gloved hand toward the north, where the valley walls rose steeply toward a jagged ridge. "We cut across. There is an old mining road that runs the spine of that ridge. The wind scours the high ground. The snow will be thinner there." Hannah looked at the slope. It was steep, dotted with black pines that looked like iron spikes against the snow. "But that is climbing. Mr. Redfern, with a wagon?" "It is the only way," Luke said, turning to look at her. His eyes were dark and serious, devoid of the mockery she was used to from men in town. "Do you trust me, Mrs. Price? Or do you want to stay here and wait for the wolves?" Hannah looked at the ridge, then back at him. She thought of the warmth of his back in the night. She thought of the way he had carried Jeremiah through the storm. "I trust you," she said. "Then get the children in the wagon." The climb was grueling. The mules strained against the harness, their breath heaving in great white clouds. Luke walked at the lead, breaking the trail with his own body, thigh deep in the snow. He coaxed the team forward with low whistles and clicks, never using the whip. Hannah walked beside the wagon, refusing to add her weight to the load. She held onto the sideboard, slipping and stumbling in the drifts, her boots soaked through. Every step was a battle. Her lungs burned with the cold air, and her legs felt like lead. By midday, they had reached the high ground. As Luke had predicted, the wind had blown much of the snow off the exposed ridge, leaving a crust of hard-packed ice and rock that the wheels could grip. But the drop-off to their left was terrifying, a sheer fall into the white abyss of the valley below. Hannah walked on the cliffside, placing her body between the wagon and the edge, her eyes fixed on the turning wheels. She was terrified, but she did not complain. She watched Luke. He moved with a kind of animal grace, reading the land. He stopped frequently to check the wind, pointing out the way the snow curled over the rocks. "See that?" he asked during a brief rest, pointing to a drift that curved like a wave. "The wind comes from the northwest here. It packs the snow hard on the lee side. We stay on the crust. If we go 10 feet to the right, we sink." Hannah nodded, fascinated despite her fear. "How do you know that?" "My grandmother," Luke said. "She taught me to read the winter. She said the wind is a woman who tells you where to walk. If you listen." Hannah looked at him, surprised. "You speak of her fondly." "She was the only mother I knew after I was 10, Luke said, checking the cinch on the lead mule. "She didn't care about blood. She cared about who could survive." He turned back to the team, leaving Hannah to ponder that. A grandmother who taught survival. It was so different from the stories told in Wind Hollow, where the Shoshone were painted as mindless savages who burned and killed without reason. As the afternoon wore on, the children in the wagon grew restless and frightened. The sheer drop and the howling wind had silenced their earlier chatter. Little Sam began to cry, a high, thin sound that grated on the nerves. Luke dropped back from the lead, walking beside the wagon wheel where the children could see him. "You crying for your supper, little man?" Luke asked. Sam sniffled, wiping his nose on a mitten. "I am scared. The wagon is going to fall." "It won't fall," Luke said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that cut under the wind. "Ghost is sure-footed. See him?" He pointed to his horse, tied to the rear gate. "Ghost knows where the edge is." "And do you know why?" "Why?" Caleb asked, leaning forward, his earlier hostility forgotten in the face of fear. "Because the rabbits told him," Luke said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. The children stared at him. "Rabbits, snowshoe rabbits," Luke said. "They have feet like paddles. They run on top of the snow. My grandmother told me that when the world was made, the rabbit was the only one who didn't complain about the cold. So the spirit gave him magic feet. When you see a rabbit track, you know the snow is safe." He pointed to a set of tracks crisscrossing the path ahead. "See there? The rabbit went first. He scouted the trail for us. The children craned their necks to see the tracks." The fear evaporated, replaced by wonder. "Did you ever catch one?" Sarah asked. Luke nodded. "A few, but you have to be fast. They turn into snow when they stop moving. You look right at them and see nothing but winter." Hannah listened from the wagon seat, her heart twisting. She watched the way Caleb and the others leaned toward him, their prejudice washed away by the cadence of his voice. He was gentle. That was the word she had never associated with Luke Redfern. Gentle. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that the monster the town had built in their minds, and in hers, did not exist. There was only this man, walking in the cold, telling stories to frighten children to make them brave. The sun was beginning to dip toward the peaks, casting long blue shadows across the snow. When they rounded a bend in the ridge and saw it, below them, in a small, sheltered bowl of the mountain, stood a chimney. It was made of black stone, rising stark and lonely from the white drifts. Around it lay the charred, skeletal remains of a house, burnt timbers poking up like ribs. The snow had softened the ruin, draping it in white, but the violence of its destruction was still etched into the landscape. Hannah stopped. She gripped the wagon rails so hard a splinter dug into her palm. She knew this place. The air left her lungs. She was 10 years old again. She could smell the smoke. She could hear the roar of the fire that had consumed the roof. She could hear her father shouting for her mother to run. "Mama, hurry!" The wagon creaked to a halt. Luke had stopped the team. He was staring at the ruin, too. Hannah climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking. She walked to the edge of the road, looking down into the hollow. That is the Miller place," Caleb said quietly. "No, wait, that is the old Price homestead." Hannah did not answer. She felt a phantom heat on her face. This was where her life had broken the first time, the night the barn burned, the night her father died fighting the flames, and she and her mother had fled into the darkness, running 5 miles to town with nothing but the clothes on their backs. She felt a presence beside her. Luke was standing there, his hat pulled low. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the ridgeline opposite, where a stand of trees offered cover. He remembered this place too. He remembered the smell of coal oil. He remembered the men he was riding with, Silas's men, laughing as they rode past the smoking ruins a few days after the Shoshone camp had been destroyed. He remembered Silas pointing at the chimney and saying, "Loose ends tied up." Luke looked at Hannah. He saw the devastation on her face. He knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that she had been the child in that house. The fire that killed her father hadn't been an accident, just as the raid on the Shoshone camp hadn't been a battle. It was all part of the same clearing. "We shouldn't stop here," Luke said, his voice rough. Hannah turned to him, her eyes glassy. "My father died there." "I know," Luke said. Hannah frowned, the grief sharpening into confusion. "How do you know? You weren't in the valley then." "You were scouting. I heard." Luke lied. He couldn't tell her. "Not here. Not yet. It would break her. There is a mining camp a mile past this," Luke said, turning away. "We can hole up there. The horses need rest." He walked back to the mules, his movements jerky and tense. Hannah watched him, a cold knot forming in her stomach. He was hiding something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She looked back at the ruin one last time, whispering a goodbye to the ghosts, and climbed back onto the wagon. The mining camp was a collection of 4 log cabins huddled in a ravine, abandoned when the silver vein played out 10 years prior. They were in better shape than the line cabin. The roofs were intact, and the doors still hung on their hinges. Luke chose the largest cabin for them. It had a stone fireplace and a dry wood floor. He worked with a manic energy, unhitching the team, chopping wood, securing the windows. It was as if he was trying to outrun his own thoughts. Hannah settled the children. They were exhausted, falling asleep almost before they finished their meager dinner of salt pork and beans. She covered them with the blankets, lingering to stroke Emma's hair. When she turned, Luke was gone. She found him in the smallest cabin at the edge of the camp, a structure that looked like it had been a foreman's office. A lantern flickered inside. Hannah pushed the door open. The wind caught it, slamming it against the wall. Luke jumped, spinning around. He was kneeling beside an old, iron-bound trunk that had been pried open. Papers were scattered on the floor around him. He held a leather-bound ledger in his hands. His face was pale beneath his tan. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "What is it?" Hannah asked, stepping inside and closing the door against the wind. "What did you find?" "Nothing," Luke said quickly. He tried to close the ledger, but his hands were shaking. "Just old trash. We should go back to the fire." "You are a terrible liar. Luke Redfern." Hannah crossed the room. She saw the name on the papers scattered on the floor. It was a letterhead she recognized. The Crow Ranch. "Why are Silas's papers here?" she asked, bewildered. Luke stood up, backing away, clutching the ledger to his chest. "Hannah, leave it, please. You don't want to know. Give it to me." "No." Hannah lunged for him. She was smaller, but she was fueled by a sudden, blinding suspicion. She grabbed the edge of the book. Luke tried to hold on, but he wouldn't use his strength against her. He let go. Hannah stumbled back, clutching the book. She opened it to the page Luke had been reading. The handwriting was precise, elegant. Silas's hand. She knew it well from the debt markers he made her sign every month. October 14th, 1874. Payment to R. Diller for services rendered. Clearing of the Painted Rock encampment. No survivors to be reported. Hannah read it twice. Painted rock. That was the Shoshone camp. The massacre. She turned the page. November 2nd, 1874. Loose ends. The Price homestead. Occupants removed. Land rights secured. The room spun. Occupants removed. Her father. Her home. It wasn't a stray spark from a lantern. It was Silas. She flipped forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dates jumped to 2 years ago. August 1876. Cattle drive. M. Price unreliable. Threatens to speak on the 74 matter. Arranged removal during Red Desert Transit. Scout blamed. Hannah made a sound that was half sob, half scream. She dropped the ledger as if it had burned her hands. It wasn't Indians, she whispered. Her voice sounded far away. It wasn't a raid. Luke stood in the corner, his head bowed. No, you knew. She accused, looking up at him. Her eyes were wide, dark pits of betrayal. You knew, I suspected, Luke said, his voice hollow. I was there the night of the Shoshone camp. I saw Silas's men. I saw Michael riding with them. Hannah flinched. Michael? He was young, Luke said. He owed Silas money. He rode with them to burn the camp. But I think he lost his stomach for it. I saw him trying to stop them from shooting the women. That is why Silas killed him. Hannah, Michael knew too much. Liar! Hannah screamed. She flew at him, hammering her fists against his chest. You are lying. Michael was a good man. He wouldn't hurt anyone. You are twisting it. Luke didn't defend himself. He stood there, taking her blows, solid as a tree. He let her scream. He let her pour out the poison of 2 years of grief and lies. He was a hero, she sobbed, her strikes losing power, turning into desperate clutches at his coat. He loved me. He did love you, Luke said softly, catching her wrists as she sagged. That is why he died. He wanted out. He wanted to be free of Silas. Hannah's legs gave way. She collapsed, sliding down the front of his coat to the floor. The grief was a physical weight, crushing the air out of her. Everything she believed, her husband's heroism, the town's pity, Silas's benevolence, it was all a rot. She had been living on the charity of the man who murdered her father and her husband. She curled into a ball on the dusty floorboards, shaking violently. Luke knelt beside her. He hovered for a moment, unsure. Then, she reached out, a blind, desperate hand clawing at the air. Luke took it. He pulled her up, gathering her into his arms. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing with a ferocity that shook her whole frame. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Luke held her tight, his hand cradling the back of her head, rocking her slightly. He didn't offer empty words. He just offered his presence, a witness to the truth. Hours later, the storm in the cabin had quieted. The children were asleep in the main cabin, unaware that the world had changed. Hannah and Luke sat outside, in the lee of the wall, a small fire crackling between them. The sky had cleared completely. The stars were brilliant shards of ice scattered across the black void. The Milky Way was a bruised smear of light. Hannah sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes dry and swollen. She stared at the fire. I have Shoshone blood, she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud to anyone but her siblings in 10 years. I know, Luke said. He was whittling again, the knife moving rhythmically. I saw your mother once, in town. You look like her. I was ashamed, Hannah confessed, her voice barely a whisper. I hid it. I let them talk about savages in the kitchen. And I said nothing. I let them spit on your name, and I said nothing. I thought if I was quiet enough, small enough, they wouldn't hurt me. Silence is not a shield. Hannah, Luke said, it is a cage. He stopped whittling and looked at the fire. I was there that night, he said quietly. At the camp. My cousins were there. My aunt. I tried to ride in to warn them, but I was too late. I saw the fire. I saw the men. I tried to pull a baby from a burning tent. A soldier, no, a hired gun, hit me with a rifle. That is how I got this. He touched the scar on his face. When I woke up, they were all dead. And the town said I did it. They said I led them into a trap. And you let them believe it? What does it matter what they believe? Luke asked bitterly. I am a half-breed to them. If a horse goes lame, it is my fault. If it snows too early, it is my fault. Silas knew he could pin it on me, and no one would ask questions. We are both broken, aren't we? Hannah said, looking at him. Luke turned to face her. The firelight danced in his dark eyes. No, we are surviving. That is different. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the strength in the set of her jaw, the fire that had kept her family alive despite Silas's boot on her neck. He saw the beauty she tried to hide under severe braids and widow's weeds. Hannah saw him too. Not the drifter, not the killer. She saw a man who had carried a secret burden for years, who had been beaten by the world but refused to stay down. She shifted closer. The cold air pressed around them, but the space between them hummed with heat. You aren't a monster. Luke, she whispered. She reached out, her hand trembling. Her fingertips grazed his cheek, tracing the ridge of the white scar. The skin was rough, warm. Luke stopped breathing. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. It was a gesture of such tenderness it hurt. He felt a hunger rise in him, sharp and sudden, a hunger not for food, but to be known, to be held. Hannah leaned in. The distance between them evaporated. Their lips met. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of wood smoke and salt tears and the metallic tang of the cold. Hannah's hands tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer. Luke's arm went around her waist, crushing her to him. They kissed with the urgency of people who had been starving for a lifetime. For a moment, there was no snow, no Silas, no dead husbands or burned homes. There was only the fire and the mouth of the other person. Luke groaned, a low sound in his throat. His hand moved up her back, pressing her closer. He wanted to lose himself in her. He wanted to take this warmth and never let it go. Then, he stopped. He pulled back, gasping for air, his forehead resting against hers. His hands gripped her shoulders. Hard. No, he whispered. Not like this. Hannah blinked, her eyes hazy with desire and confusion. She reached for him again. Luke, he caught her hands. Hannah, stop. Look at me. She looked. His eyes were black and intense. You are hurting, he said, his voice rough. You are grieving a man you thought you knew, and you are scared. If we do this tonight, if I take you into that cabin, it will be because you want to forget. I want you, she said fiercely. I know, Luke said, and God help me, I want you more than I have ever wanted anything. But I won't be another mistake you make to survive. He squeezed her hands, then let them go. When you come to me, Hannah, I want it to be because you are choosing me, not because I am the only one here. I want you to look at me in the daylight, when the fear is gone, and decide. He stood up, grabbing his blanket. He looked down at her, and the longing on his face was so naked it almost broke her heart. I'm going to sleep with the horses, he said hoarsely, because if I stay here, I won't be able to stop. He turned and walked away into the dark, his boots crunching on the snow. Hannah sat by the fire, shivering, her lips still burning from his kiss. She felt rejected, yes, but beneath that was something else, a strange, swelling pride. He had respected her enough to say no. He had seen her worth, even when she couldn't see it herself. She touched her mouth, staring at the spot where he had vanished. I will choose you, Luke Redfern, she whispered to the stars. Just you wait. The wind battered the walls of the mining cabin, rattling the loose chinking like the bones of the dead. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the smell of old dust. Luke stood by the table, the leather-bound ledger resting under his hand like a loaded weapon. He had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his gaze was steady, fixed on Hannah. We go back, Luke said. His voice was low, leaving no room for argument. Hannah stood by the window, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She looked at the children sleeping in the corner, then back at Luke. To Wind Hollow? That is suicide. You saw what is in that book. Silas killed my husband. He burned my father's home. If we go back there, he will kill us too. We have to go to Laramie. We take the evidence to the marshal there." "And then what?" Luke asked, stepping around the table. "Do you think a marshal in Laramie cares about a dead Shoshone camp in Wind Hollow? Do you think he will ride over the pass in winter to arrest a man as rich as Silas Crow? No, he will file a report. He will send a letter in the spring. And by then, Silas will have buried this deeper than the silver in these mines." Hannah shook her head. "But the children are not safe anywhere as long as Silas holds the valley." Luke interrupted. "If we run, we are just loose ends. He will send men to find us. He will hunt us down on the road to Laramie, and there will be no witnesses out there in the snow." He walked closer to her, his presence filling the small room. "We have to finish this where it started. Hannah, we have to make the town look at it. We have to make them see the blood on his money. If we run, the lie wins." Hannah looked at him. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the warrior's resolve that had kept him alive for 30 years in a world that wanted him dead. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was crazy, but deep down, she knew he was right. Silas Crow was a rot. You could not outrun rot, you had to cut it out. And yet, the thought of him riding back into the lion's den, alone, terrified her more than the snow. "I will not let you go alone," she said softly. "I am not asking you to go," Luke said. "I can take the wagon to the turnoff. You take the children to Laramie. I will ride back with the book." "No," Hannah said. The word was sharp. "I am not going to Laramie while you get hanged in Wind Hollow. If we go back together. I am a witness too." Luke studied her face. He saw the fear there, plain and naked. But he also saw the iron that had held her spine straight through 2 years of widowhood. He nodded once. "Pack the blankets," he said. "We leave in the hour." The return journey was harder than the climb up. The wind had scrubbed the sky clear, leaving a dome of blinding, heartless blue. The sun reflected off the snow with a glare that felt like sand in the eyes. They moved cautiously, staying to the tree line where the shadows of the pines offered some cover. Luke rode Ghost 100 yards ahead of the wagon, his rifle resting across his saddle. He doubled back frequently, his eyes scanning the back trail. Around noon, he signaled for Hannah to stop the wagon. He rode back, his face grim. "What is it?" Hannah asked, seeing the tension in his shoulders. "Tracks," Luke said, pointing to a ridge they had crossed 2 hours ago. 3 riders, maybe 4. They are cutting for sign. Silas's men, has to be. They are moving fast. They know we are up here." Hannah looked at the children huddled in the back of the wagon. Caleb was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. "We get off the road," Luke said. "There is a ravine 2 miles east. It is narrow, easy to defend. We can't outrun them in the wagon, so we have to make them hesitate." They pushed the mules hard. The ravine was a slash in the earth, choked with fallen timber and boulders. Luke drove the wagon deep into the shadow of a hanging cliff, tucking it behind a massive fallen pine that acted as a natural breastwork. "Get the children behind the log," Luke ordered. "Dismounting. Keep their heads down. Do not let them make a sound." Hannah herded the children into the snow behind the tree trunk. She wrapped them in the buffalo robes, whispering fierce, meaningless comforts. "It is a game," she told little Sam, though her voice shook. "We are hiding from the wolves. You have to be as quiet as a mouse." Luke took a position at the mouth of the ravine, wedging himself between 2 boulders. He laid his rifle on the rock, checked the breech, and waited. The sun began to dip, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange. The cold deepened, settling into the valley like a weight. Then, the crack of a rifle shattered the stillness. A bullet struck the rock inches from Luke's head, sending a spray of granite chips into the air. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a rolling thunder that made the children scream. "Down!" Hannah yelled, pushing Caleb's head into the snow. Luke returned fire instantly, the boom of his Winchester rolling over the lighter crack of the attacker's pistols. He worked the lever with a smooth, deadly rhythm. "They are on the ridge," Luke shouted back to her without turning. "Stay low!" More shots rang out. The attackers were firing blindly into the ravine, hoping to flush them out. Bullets thudded into the wagon box and snapped branches from the pine tree. One of the horses screamed, a high, terrible sound, as a slug grazed its flank. The team plunged in their traces, the wagon rocking violently. "Whoa!" Hannah shouted, trying to calm them, but she couldn't rise. Suddenly, Caleb cried out. He scrambled back from the edge of the log, clutching his arm. Blood, dark and steaming, seeped between his fingers. "I'm hit!" Caleb wailed. "I'm hit!" Hannah crawled to him, ignoring the whistle of lead overhead. "Let me see." It was a flesh wound, a gouge across the bicep, but it was bleeding freely. Hannah didn't think. She reached under her heavy coat, grabbed the hem of her petticoat, and ripped a long strip of white cotton from the fabric. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot, but she bound the arm tight. "Press on it. Caleb," she commanded, her voice harsh with fear. "Press hard." In the midst of the chaos, a figure appeared at the top of the scree slope on the far side of the ravine. It was not one of the cowboys. It was a man in ragged furs, clutching a battered hat, stumbling and sliding down the loose rock toward them. "Don't shoot!" the man screamed, his voice cracking. "Don't shoot! I got the papers!" Luke swung his rifle toward the newcomer, hesitating. The man was unarmed, waving his arms frantically. "Get down, you fool!" Luke roared. But the attackers on the ridge saw him too. A shot rang out, distinct and sharp. The old man jerked as if pulled by an invisible wire. He spun around, clutching his chest, and collapsed into the snow at the bottom of the slope, just yards from Luke's position. Luke cursed. He abandoned his cover, sprinting across the open ground. Bullets kicked up snow around his boots. He grabbed the old man by the collar of his coat and dragged him behind the shelter of a large boulder. Hannah watched, horrified. She saw Luke lean over the man, pressing a hand to his chest. The man was coughing, pink froth bubbling on his lips. It was old Jeb, a prospector who had been drifting through these hills for 20 years. A man everyone thought was crazy from mercury fumes. "Papers," Jeb gasped, his hand fumbling inside his coat. He pulled out a packet wrapped in oilskin, stained now with his own blood. "Take 'em, Silas. He wants 'em back." "Why?" Luke asked, gripping the man's shoulder. "Why do you have these?" "Insurance," Jeb whispered, his eyes losing focus. "I drove the wagon. That night. The oil. I carried the oil. Luke went still. The night of the fire. I wrote it down." Jeb wheezed. "I wrote it all down. In case he came for me. The cave. Up by the Devil's Thumb. More in there." Jeb shuddered once, a long, rattling breath escaping his lungs. And then he was gone. His eyes stared up at the darkening sky. Empty. Luke took the oilskin packet. He looked at the dead man, then up at the ridge. The firing had stopped. The attackers were losing the light, and the temperature was dropping towards 0. They wouldn't risk coming down into the ravine in the dark against a man with a rifle. Luke ran back to the fallen log, crouching low. "They are pulling back," he said, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "But they will be back at first light. We have to move." "Who was that?" Hannah asked, staring at the body in the snow. "A witness," Luke said grimly. "Another loose end Silas just tied up, but he gave us the knot. They moved the wagon under the cover of darkness. It was a nightmare drive, navigating the rocks by starlight. But fear was a potent motivator. Luke led them toward the formation known as the Devil's Thumb, a spire of rock 3 miles away. They found the cave Jeb had spoken of near the base of the spire. It was little more than a fissure in the rock, hidden by scrub brush. Luke lit a lantern, shielding the glass with his coat. Inside, tucked onto a dry shelf of rock, was a metal strongbox. He smashed the lock with the butt of his pistol. Inside were stacks of paper, brittle with the dry cold. Hannah stood beside him, her breath hitching. Luke handed her a folded sheet of paper. "Read it," he said. Hannah unfolded the paper. It was a deposition, written in a shaky, uneducated hand, but signed clearly by Jebediah Smith and witnessed by a circuit judge who had died 5 years prior. I, Jebediah Smith, being of sound mind, do confess that on the order of Silas Crow, I did purchase and transport 20 gallons of kerosene to the settlement at Painted Rock. I did witness Mr. Crow give the order to burn the tents. I did witness the shooting of the fleeing women. Mr. Crow told us it was a necessary clearing for the cattle. Hannah lowered the paper. Her stomach turned. There is more, Luke said. He held up a letter. This one is from Silas to the marshal. Diller, make sure Price is on the drive. He is becoming unstable. If he falls off his horse in the dark, no one will ask questions. I will cover the funeral costs. Hannah took the letter. She stared at the signature. The loops of the S and C were sharp, aggressive. He bought my husband's coffin, she whispered, the horror rising in her throat like bile. He stood in the church and shook my hand. He held the dead over my head, and he paid for the bullet. Her hands began to shake, crumpling the paper. A sound tore out of her throat, a scream of pure, undiluted rage that echoed off the cave walls. She sank to her knees, clutching the letter to her chest. Everything was a lie. Her widowhood, her poverty, her shame. It had all been engineered by one man's greed. Luke knelt beside her. He didn't try to shush her. He put a hand on her back, feeling the tremors racking her body. Hannah, he said softly. Now you know. I want him dead, she hissed, looking up. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were hard as flint. I want to kill him myself. We will get him, Luke said, but not with a bullet. If we shoot him, he becomes a martyr. We have to kill his name. We have to make the town see this. Hannah looked at the papers in her hand. She thought of her mother, hiding in the kitchen. She thought of Luke, bleeding in the snow. She thought of Michael, terrified and trapped. I will read this, she said, her voice turning cold and steady. I will stand in the church and I will read every word, and I don't care if they burn me for it. Luke looked at her, and he saw the change. The frightened widow was gone. In her place was something dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. The victory of finding the evidence was short-lived. The mountain exacted its toll the very next morning. The storm had passed, but it left behind a vacuum of cold that sucked the life out of the air. The thermometer, had they had one, would have read 20 below zero. In the wagon, little Jeremiah, the boy who had been coughing for days, took a turn for the worse. His breathing turned raspy, a wet, rattling sound that filled the small space under the canvas. Hannah sat with him, wrapping him in every blanket they had, including her own coat. She heated stones in the fire and placed them at his feet. She melted snow and tried to get him to drink warm water mixed with a little molasses. Luke drove the wagon, pushing the team as fast as he dared, desperate to get to lower elevation. But the descent was slow. By evening, Jeremiah's skin was gray. He looked at Hannah with eyes that were too large for his face. Mama, he whispered. Delirious. I am here, Hannah said, smoothing his hair. She wasn't his mother, but in this frozen hell, she was the only mother he had. Luke stopped the wagon. He climbed into the back, his large frame filling the space. He looked at the boy, then at Hannah. He shook his head slightly. He sat with them through the night. They took turns holding the boy, keeping him upright so he could breathe. Luke told stories in a low drone. Stories of the summer buffalo hunts, of the sun on the grass, of warm places where the wind never blew. Just before dawn, the rattling in Jeremiah's chest stopped. He let out a long, soft sigh, and then he was still. The silence in the wagon was louder than the wind. Hannah held the small body for a long time. She didn't cry. She felt as if she had no tears left. She felt brittle, like a branch that had been frozen and snapped. Luke reached out and gently closed the boy's eyes. We have to bury him, he said. We can't take him down. The wolves will follow the scent. They dug the grave in the shelter of a rock overhang. The ground was frozen solid. Luke had to use a pickaxe, chipping away the earth inch by painful inch. It took them hours to dig a hole deep enough. They wrapped Jeremiah in one of the blankets. Hannah placed her own wool scarf around his neck. Luke carved a piece of the wagon board. Jeremiah, 1873 to 1878, safe home. They piled stones over the grave to keep the scavengers away. The other children stood in a circle, shivering, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Hannah placed her hand on the cold stones. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." She stood up and turned to face the valley below. Wind Hollow was down there, hidden in the gray mist. "I am not letting him win," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but heavy with promise. Silas Crow thinks he can treat people like cattle to be culled. He thinks children are just overhead costs. She looked at Luke. "Drive the wagon. Luke, get us to that town. I have a funeral to interrupt." They were 2 days from Wind Hollow. The grief in the wagon had settled into a grim determination. They spoke little during the day, focusing on the mechanics of survival. Keep moving, keep warm, keep eating. But at night, by the fire. The silence between Hannah and Luke changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, or even allies. It was the silence of two people who were the only real things in a world of ghosts. They camped near a stand of lodgepole pine. The wind was low, but the cold was a physical weight. Luke sat cleaning his rifle, the metal gleaming in the firelight. Hannah sat opposite him, mending a tear in Caleb's coat. "They will try to stop us before we get to the church," Luke said without looking up. "I know," Hannah replied. "I can draw them off. I can ride in from the north, make a noise. You take the wagon in from the south road?" "No," Hannah said. She set the coat down. "We walk in together. If we split up, they will pick us off. And besides, the Shoshone need to see us together." Luke looked up. "You still want to call them in?" "They deserve to be there," Hannah said. "They're the ones who died. If we're going to tell the truth, we tell all of it. My mother's truth, too." She looked at him, her eyes defying him to argue. "You are a brave woman." "Hannah Price," Luke said softly. "I am not brave," she said. "I am just tired of being afraid." She shivered then, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with courage. "You are cold," Luke said. Hannah looked at him. She looked at the single blanket wrapped around his shoulders. She looked at the space beside him. She stood up and walked around the fire. She didn't ask this time. She sat down beside him and pulled the edge of his blanket over her shoulders. Luke went still for a second. Then he opened his arm and gathered her in. They sat huddled together, thigh to thigh, chest to chest. The heat of their bodies created a small island of life in the sea of snow. Hannah turned her face into his coat. She could smell him, gun oil, wood smoke, and the deep, musky scent of a man. She felt the beat of his heart against her cheek. "We might die tomorrow," she whispered. "We might," Luke answered, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I don't want to die without—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. She tipped her head back, finding his eyes in the dark. Luke looked at her. The hunger in his face was raw, unguarded. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't pull away. She rose to meet him. Their mouths met, and the world narrowed down to the point of contact. It was a kiss of desperation, of grief, of a need so profound it wiped out the cold. Hannah's hands gripped the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer. She opened her mouth to him, tasting the salt of tears, his or hers. She didn't know. Luke's hand tangled in her hair, pulling the pins loose, the heavy dark braid uncoiled, falling over her shoulders. He groaned, a sound of surrender, and kissed the line of her jaw, her throat. Hannah's hands moved to the buttons of his coat. She wanted skin. She wanted to feel the life in him, to know that they were still here, still burning. "Let's run," she whispered against his neck. "Let's just go. There is a cabin up on the Green River. We could make it. We could hide." Luke froze. His hand, which had been moving toward her waist, stopped. He pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. "No," he rasped. Hannah made a sound of protest, trying to pull him back, but he held her shoulders firm. "Hannah, stop! Why?" she demanded, her voice thick with desire. "Why do you always stop?" "Because I am not taking you in a snowbank like a fugitive," Luke said fiercely. He framed her face with his rough hands. "Look at me." She looked. His eyes were blazing. "I am not going to be another secret you keep in the dark. I am not going to be something you steal in moments of fear. When I lie with you, Hannah, and I will lie with you, it will be under a roof that I built. It will be in a bed that belongs to us, and it will be because we are free, not because we are running. But we might not get there," Hannah whispered, tears spilling over. "Then we die with that hope." Luke said, "But I won't tarnish this. You are worth more than a stolen night in the dirt." He kissed her forehead, a hard, sealing press of his lips. Then he pulled the blanket tighter around her, tucking her against his side. "We sleep," he said, "and tomorrow we go to war." Hannah lay against him, listening to the steady thump of his heart. The frustration burned in her, hot and aching, but beneath it was that strange, new feeling again. He honored her in a life where she had been owned, traded, and indebted. This man, this savage, was the first one to treat her like a queen. She closed her eyes, clutching his coat. "Build me that roof." "Luke," she thought, "you better build me that roof." Wind Hollow looked exactly as they had left it, yet it felt to Hannah like a foreign country. The wagon rolled down Main Street at high noon, the wheels groaning and popping in the biting cold. The snow here was packed into hard, brown ruts, mixed with horse manure and coal ash. The town was awake, and it was watching. As the battered wagon passed the general store, the door opened. 2 women stepped out, shawls wrapped tight. They stopped dead, staring at the canvas cover, then at Luke riding on the bench, then at Hannah. They did not wave. They leaned together, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes darting with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Word travels faster than a wagon," Luke said quietly, his eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways. "What do they know?" Hannah asked, sitting rigid beside him. "Whatever Silas told them. That we are dead, or that I killed you, or that we robbed the mail, it doesn't matter. Look at them." Hannah looked. A group of men outside the saloon had stopped talking. They were watching Luke with hands resting near their belt buckles. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating suspicion. It pressed against Hannah's chest, making it hard to breathe. "Drive to the church," Hannah said. Luke hesitated. "The livery is safer. We can leave the horses." "Drive to the church. Luke," she repeated, her voice brittle but hard. "I am not hiding in a stable. We are going to the house of God, and we are going to ring the bell." Luke looked at her, seeing the frantic, terrifying resolve in her eyes. He nodded once, snapping the reins over the exhausted mules. They pulled up to the white-clapboard church. It sat silent and cold, the snow piled high against its foundation. Hannah climbed down before the wheels stopped rolling. She reached back into the wagon and grabbed the heavy iron box containing the ledgers and the confession. "Stay with the children," she told Luke. "No," Luke said, wrapping the reins around the brake lever. "I am not letting you walk into that crossfire alone." He jumped down, his boots crunching on the ice. He pulled his hat low, checking the thong on his pistol holster, and followed her. Hannah marched up the steps and threw open the double doors. The sanctuary was empty, smelling of stale incense and damp wood. She walked straight to the vestibule where the bell rope hung, a thick, braided hemp line. She grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The bell above them gave a dull, heavy clank. She pulled again, putting her whole weight into it. Clang, clang, clang. The sound rolled out over the valley, harsh and demanding. It was the sound of fire, of emergency, of death. It did not take long. In Wind Hollow, the church bell in the middle of a Tuesday meant only one thing: trouble. People began to stream out of the buildings. Men in aprons, women in housecoats, ranch hands from the saloon. They gathered in the snow-packed yard, looking up at the steeple, then at the wagon, then at the open doors. Silas Crow arrived last. He walked from his office with a slow, deliberate stride. Flanked by Marshal Diller and two of his hired guns, he wore a long coat with a beaver collar, his gray eyes calm, showing no surprise at seeing the wagon he had sent to be buried in the snow. Hannah let go of the rope. Her hands were raw. She walked to the front of the church, standing on the top step, the iron box at her feet. Luke stood one step down and to her right, his body angled to shield her, his hand nowhere near his gun but ready all the same. The crowd murmured. A sea of confused faces. Mrs. Price? Reverend Thomas pushed through the front, looking bewildered. We heard the wagon was lost. We were not lost, Hannah said. Her voice shook, thin and high in the cold air. But it carried. We were hunted. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Hunted? The Reverend asked. By whom? By the men Silas Crow sent to ensure we never made it to Laramie, Hannah declared, pointing a trembling finger at the rancher. Silas stepped forward, a look of deep, pained concern on his face. He took off his hat, holding it over his heart. Hannah, my dear, he said, his voice soothing, like a parent speaking to a feverish child. You are safe, thank God. We were so worried. The riders came back saying you had been taken by wolves, or, worse, they said Luke here had gone mad in the storm. He is lying, Hannah shouted. She reached down and opened the lockbox. Pulling out the sheaf of papers, she held them up, the wind catching the edges. I have the proof. I have his own ledgers. I have a confession from Jebediah Smith, signed before he died 2 days ago. She unfolded the paper, the movement frantic. She began to read, her voice gaining strength with every horrific sentence. I, Jebediah Smith, did purchase 20 gallons of kerosene, order of Silas Crow. Burn the tents. No survivors. The crowd went silent. The words hung in the air, ugly and impossible. She grabbed another paper. Michael Price. Remove him. Make it look like an accident. She looked up, tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. My husband didn't die in an Indian raid, Hannah screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. There was no raid. Silas had him killed because Michael was going to tell the truth about the massacre at Painted Rock. She looked at the faces of her neighbors. Mrs. Gable, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith. He killed them. He burned the Shoshone families in their beds to clear the land for his cattle. And then he killed my husband to cover it up. For a moment, the truth stood there, naked and shivering. The Reverend looked at Silas, his face pale. Marshal Diller shifted his weight, looking at his boots. Then, Silas laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, devoid of humor. He shook his head, looking around at the townsfolk with a weary, pitying smile. Oh, Hannah, he said softly, the grief has finally broken you. He turned to the crowd. Do you hear this? The poor woman is out of her mind. 2 years of mourning, the stress of the journey. It has snapped her reason. He pointed a gloved hand at the papers. Forgeries, Silas said dismissively. Scribbles from a mercury-mad prospector and a woman blinded by sorrow. Do you really think the man who built this town, the man who keeps you all fed, would burn women and children? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. Or is it more likely that she has been twisted by the company she keeps? He looked at Luke. Luke Redfern, Silas said, spitting the name. The man who hates this town, the man who owes me a debt. Tell me, neighbors, who is more likely to write these lies, the rancher who protects you, or the half-breed who wants to see Wind Hollow burn? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Yes, that made sense. A half-breed would lie. A grieving widow could be tricked. He seduced her, Silas said, his voice filled with moral outrage. He dragged her into the wilderness, turned her against her own people, and filled her head with poison. Look at her. She stands there beside him like a squaw. The slur hit Hannah like a physical blow. She saw the change in the eyes of the women. The pity was gone, replaced by disgust. They looked at Luke, then at her, imagining sins committed in the dark of the wagon. I am not mad, Hannah cried, stepping forward. I am telling you the truth. She looked desperately at the faces she had known her whole life. You know me. I cooked your meals. I taught your children. And who are you? Really? Silas asked, cold and sharp. Hannah froze. She looked at Luke. He was watching the crowd, his face a mask of stone, waiting for the violence he knew was coming. He nodded to her, a tiny, imperceptible movement. Tell them. Hannah drew a breath. It felt like inhaling broken glass. My mother was Shoshone. She said. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a vacuum. Her name was Morning Dove, Hannah said, her voice ringing out. She died of fever in this town, terrified to speak her own language because of how you treated her. The people Silas burned at Painted Rock. They were my aunts, my cousins, my blood. She looked at Mrs. Gable, you hated my hair. You told me to cover it because you knew. You all knew. And you made me ashamed. She stepped to the edge of the porch, looking down at them. I am not white. I am Shoshone. And the blood on Silas Crow's hands is my blood. The reaction was visceral. Mrs. Gable recoiled, pulling her shawl tight as if Hannah were contagious. A man in the front row spat on the ground. The word savage was whispered. Gaining volume as it passed from lip to lip, the social line Hannah had walked for 24 years. The delicate tightrope of acceptance snapped. She was no longer the tragic widow. She was the enemy. Silas smiled. He had won. He didn't even have to argue the evidence now. Marshal, Silas barked, his voice commanding. Arrest that man. For what? Luke asked, his hand hovering near his gun. For the murder of Jebediah Smith, Silas said, smooth as oil. My men found his body in the ravine. Shot in the back, and for kidnapping Mrs. Price and driving her out of her wits. That is a lie, Hannah screamed. Silas's men shot Jeb. Marshal, Silas roared. Do your duty, or do I need to find a marshal who will? Marshal Diller pulled his gun. He looked sweaty and sick, but he pointed the Colt at Luke's chest. Drop the belt. Redfern, don't make me kill you here on the church steps. Luke looked at the marshal. Then he looked at the men flanking Silas, hard men with rifles already leveled. Then he looked at Hannah. If he drew, he could kill Silas. He knew he could. But the return fire would cut Hannah to ribbons. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt. It dropped to the frozen wood with a heavy thud. Don't hurt her, Luke said to the marshal. Diller stepped forward, jamming his gun into Luke's ribs. Get moving! 2 men grabbed Luke, twisting his arms behind his back. The rough handling sparked a roar of approval from the crowd. Someone threw a clump of ice. It struck Luke's cheek, drawing blood. No! Hannah lunged for him, but Mrs. Gable and another woman caught her arms, holding her back with surprising strength. Let him go! Hannah shrieked, struggling against them. You are monsters, all of you! Silas stepped up to her. He looked into her tear-streaked face and sighed. Take her to the boarding house, he ordered the women. Lock her in her room. We will decide what to do with the children later. Luke was dragged down the steps. He didn't look back. He kept his head up, his eyes locked on Silas, a promise of violence in his stare that made the rancher take a half-step back. They hauled him through the snow toward the small stone jailhouse at the end of the street. Hannah watched him go, her screams turning into sobbing gasps as she was dragged in the opposite direction. The evidence box kicked aside into the snow, the papers fluttering away in the wind like dead leaves. The jailhouse was a stone box that smelled of damp straw and despair. There was no heat. The single cell was barred with iron thick as a man's wrist. Luke sat on the narrow bunk, his hands unbound but his body aching. The cold seeped through his coat, settling in his joints. Through the high, barred window, he could hear the town. It was a low, angry hum, like a hive of hornets stirred with a stick. He knew that sound. It was the sound of whiskey being opened and ropes being tested. He stood up and walked to the bars. Diller sat at the desk in the outer office, staring at a bottle of rye. You know they are coming, Luke said. Diller didn't look up. Silas says there will be a hearing tomorrow. There won't be a tomorrow. Diller. Once the sun goes down and the whiskey sets in, Silas will tell them that justice can't wait. You are the law. You can stop this." Diller laughed, a bitter, wheezing sound. "I am the law, as long as Silas pays for the badge. I can't stop a mob. Redfern. I just hope they don't burn the building down with me in it." The outer door crashed open. Diller jumped, reaching for his gun. It wasn't the mob, it was Hannah. She looked wild. Her hair was loose, blowing around her face. Her coat was torn at the shoulder where she had broken free from the boarding house. She held a heavy stove poker in one hand, her eyes blazing. "Get out of my way! Marshal!" she snarled. "Now! Hannah!" Diller started, standing up. "Move!" She swung the poker, striking the desk with a crack that sent the whiskey bottle spinning. "I am seeing him." Diller looked at the poker, then at her face. He saw a woman who had crossed every line and no longer cared about consequences. He sank back into his chair, waving a hand toward the cell. "5 minutes," he muttered. "Then you leave, or I drag you out." Hannah dropped the poker and ran to the bars. "Luke!" She grabbed the cold iron, pressing her face into the gap. Luke was there instantly, his hands covering hers on the bars. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning his face. "That cut on your cheek." "I am fine," Luke said. His voice was urgent. "Low. Hannah, you have to get the children. You have to take the wagon and leave. Now. Tonight. I am not leaving you. You have to listen to them outside. They are going to hang me. Hannah, Silas won't let me live to see a judge. I won't let them." Hannah sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. "I will stand in front of the door. I will kill Silas myself. Hannah, stop!" Luke reached through the bars, cupping her face. His thumbs wiped away the tears. "Look at me." She looked. His dark eyes were filled with a terrible, aching tenderness. "You cannot save me this time, but you can save the truth. You get out. You go to Laramie. You tell them, I don't care about the truth. I care about you." The confession ripped out of her. "I am sorry." She wept, pressing her forehead against the bars. "I am so sorry I waited. I am sorry I was ashamed. I should have stood beside you years ago. I should have told them all to go to hell. You are standing here now," Luke whispered. "That is all that matters." He leaned closer, the iron pressing into his chest. "I have loved you since the night of the fire," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw you running through the smoke, holding your mother's hand. I watched you grow up in this town that tried to crush you. I watched you marry Michael, and I hated him. Not because he was white, but because he wasn't brave enough to deserve you." He closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers through the gap. "I thought I would die without ever telling you." Hannah let out a broken sound. She pulled his face closer, ignoring the metal digging into her skin. She kissed him. It was awkward, impeded by the bars, desperate and clumsy. Her lips met his, tasting of the iron of the cell and the salt of her tears. It was a kiss of goodbye, a kiss of defiance. Luke's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her as close as physics would allow, trying to memorize the feel of her. For a moment, the jail faded, the mob faded. There was only the heat of their breath and the desperate pressure of their mouths. The door banged open again. "Time is up," Diller said, standing up. "And you better get out the back way. Mrs. Price, they are gathering in the street." Hannah pulled back, her eyes wide with panic. No, I am not going." Luke gripped her shoulders through the bars. "Go, get Tommy and Emma. Be the survivor I know you are." He pushed her gently away. "Go!" Hannah looked at him one last time, searing his image into her mind, the scar, the dark eyes, the love that shone there even in the shadow of death. She turned and ran, sobbing, out the back door into the gathering dusk. Night fell like a hammer. The temperature dropped, but the heat in the street was rising. A bonfire had been lit in front of the saloon. The flickering orange light cast long, dancing shadows against the buildings. A crowd of 50 men had gathered. A rope had been thrown over the limb of the big cottonwood tree that stood by the livery stable. Silas Crow stood on a crate near the fire. He held a bottle of whiskey, passing it down to the men. "We gave him a chance," Silas shouted. his voice carrying over the wind. "We let him live among us, and how does he repay us? He kills a harmless old man. He attacks our wagons. He corrupts a grieving widow. Hang him," someone shouted. "Do we wait for a judge from Laramie?" Silas asked. "Do we wait for him to escape and kill again?" "No!" the crowd roared. "This is justice," Silas yelled. "This is protecting our own." Marshal Diller stood inside the jail, peering through the shutter. He was sweating despite the cold. "They are coming." Redfern. Luke stood in the center of the cell. He had said his prayers. He was ready. "Just give me a gun." "Diller," Luke said calmly. "Let me go out fighting. Don't let them string me up like a dog." Diller hesitated. His hand moved to his holster. Suddenly, a massive boom shook the building. The back wall of the jailhouse groaned. The glass in the windows shattered inward. "What in God's name?" Diller yelled. Ducking, smoke began to pour into the room, thick and black, smelling of coal dust and sulfur. "Outside," a voice screamed. "Fire! The blacksmith shop is blowing up!" Diller ran to the window. The blacksmith shop, located directly behind the jail, was belching smoke and sparks. The confusion in the street was instant. The mob turned, distracted by the threat of a fire spreading to the wooden town. The back door of the jail kicked open. A massive figure loomed in the smoke. It was Elias, the blacksmith. He wore his heavy leather apron, his face smeared with soot. He held a sledgehammer in one hand and a heavy ring of keys in the other. "Elias?" Diller stammered. "Get out of here, Marshal," Elias growled. "Elias, go help put out the fire before the wind takes the whole town." Diller looked at Elias, then at the keys. He looked at Luke in the cell. The marshal made a choice. He grabbed his hat and ran out the front door, shouting about bucket brigades. Elias strode to the cell door. He didn't use the keys. He swung the sledgehammer. Clang. The lock mechanism, old and brittle with cold, shattered under the blow of a man who bent iron for a living. The door swung open. Luke stepped out, coughing in the smoke. "Elias, why?" "My boy rode with Michael Price," Elias said, his voice gruff. "He didn't come back from the desert. Silas said it was a snake bite. But my boy, he wrote me a letter before he left. Said he was scared of what Silas was making them do." Elias shoved a heavy object into Luke's hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a heavy blacksmith's hammer. "Silas killed my boy too," Elias said. "Just took me longer to admit it." Luke gripped the hammer. "I am going out there. I am going to kill him." "No," Elias said, grabbing Luke's arm. "You go out there now. They shoot you down. There are 50 men with guns. Luke, you die. The story dies." He pointed to the back alley, where the shadows were deep. "My horse is tied behind the shop. He is fresh. You ride—" "Ride where?" Luke asked, his eyes wild. "I can't leave Hannah. Hannah is safe for tonight. Silas won't touch her while the town is watching, but you need an army. Luke, you can't fight this town alone." Luke hesitated. He looked at the front door, where the orange light of the bonfire flickered. He wanted blood. He wanted to smash Silas Crow's face with the hammer. But Elias was right. Martyrdom would not save Hannah. "The Shoshone," Luke whispered. "What?" "The families," Luke said. "The ones who lost kin at Painted Rock. They are camped in the Wind River Valley for the winter." "Bring them," Elias said. "Bring the wrath of God. Son, but go." Luke looked at the blacksmith. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make him pay." Luke turned and sprinted out the back door, diving into the smoke and the shadows. He found the horse, a big roan stallion, tied to the fence. He vaulted into the saddle. As he spurred the horse toward the ridge, keeping to the darkness, he looked back. The jailhouse was surrounded now. The mob was kicking in the door, screaming for blood. They would find an empty cell. Luke turned his face to the wind. He rode not to escape, but to gather the storm. He would bring back change, and it would come riding on the backs of painted ponies. The high country was a graveyard of granite and ice, and Luke Redfern moved through it like a ghost. For 3 days, the posse Silas Crow had hired picked their way through the foothills, their heavy coats dark against the snow, their breath steaming in the bitter air. They were trackers, men who knew the land, but they did not know it like Luke. He led them in circles. He walked backward in his own prints for half a mile, then leaped onto a shelf of wind-scoured rock where no boot would leave a mark. He waded through the freezing slush of the creek for an hour, letting the water numb his legs to the bone, just to kill his scent. At night, he did not light a fire. He burrowed into deep drifts beneath the low-hanging boughs of spruce trees, wrapping himself in his buffalo coat, sleeping in 20-minute bursts. He watched them from the ridgelines. He saw their frustration grow. He saw them argue, pointing fingers at the empty white expanse. They were hunting a man, but Luke had become something else. He had become the winter itself, cold, silent, and inevitable, but he could not stay in the mountains forever. His supplies were gone. The cold was a slow poison in his blood, and down in the valley, the rot was still spreading. In Wind Hollow, the fear had curdled into a suffocating tension. Silas Crow walked the streets like a king whose crown was slipping. He smiled too much. He shook hands too hard. On a Tuesday evening, he came to the boarding house. Hannah was in the kitchen, rolling dough for the morning biscuits. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs when the door opened and Silas stepped in, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. "Mrs. Price," Silas said, removing his hat. He looked tired. "I am working. Mr. Crow," Hannah said, not looking up. "You know," Silas said, walking around the table, trailing a gloved finger through the flour dust. "Accidents happen so easily in winter. A slip on the ice, a stove that catches fire. It would be a tragedy if something happened to you, or to those children." Hannah stopped rolling. She set the pin down with a solid thud. She looked up at him, and for the first time in her life, she did not see the powerful rancher. She saw a small, frightened man hiding behind a wall of money. "Are you threatening to kill me too, Silas?" she asked. "Like you killed my husband? Like you killed Jeb?" Silas's eyes went flat and cold. The charm evaporated. "You are a hysterical woman repeating the lies of a fugitive," he whispered. "And if you don't shut your mouth, Hannah, I will shut it for you. And I will send those siblings of yours to an orphanage so far away they will forget your name." Hannah picked up a paring knife from the table. She didn't raise it. She just held it, her knuckles white. "You can kill me," she said, her voice trembling but steel hard. "But you cannot kill the truth. It is already out. Silas, it is whispering in your own bunkhouse. It is whispering in the church." Silas looked at the knife, then at her eyes. He sneered, a twisted expression of disgust. "You are just like your mother." He spat, a savage in a dress. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the plates rattled on the shelf. Hannah stood there for a long time, the knife in her hand, breathing in the silence. She was terrified, but she was no longer paralyzed. That night, Hannah put on her cloak and walked through the back alleys to the blacksmith's shop. The forge was cold, but a single lantern burned in the back. Elias sat on an anvil, polishing a rifle. Reverend Thomas was there, looking pale and sick, along with Mr. Henderson, whose cousin had died 2 years prior. "We cannot fight him alone," the Reverend said, wringing his hands. "He has 12 men on the payroll. The marshal is in his pocket. We don't need guns," Hannah said, stepping into the light. "We need witnesses. We need the town to see him, really see him. And how do we do that?" Elias asked. "He owns the town. We take away his mask." Hannah said, "Saturday night, the winter dance. He will be there, playing the benevolent father. He will be pretending everything is fine. That is where we break him." "It is dangerous," Henderson muttered. "Living here is dangerous," Hannah shot back. "My husband is dead. Your cousin is dead. Elias's son is dead. How many more ghosts do we need before we stand up?" The men looked at the floor. The shame of their silence was a heavy thing, but Hannah's anger was a spark. "I am with you," Elias grunted. "Me too," Henderson said. "God help us," the Reverend whispered. "But it is right." While Hannah built a wall of resolve in the valley, Luke rode north. He pushed the roan stallion to its limit, crossing the frozen sage flats to the Wind River. He found the winter camp tucked into a canyon where the hot springs kept the snow at bay. The tippies were smoked brown, sturdy against the wind. Dogs barked as he approached, and men with Winchesters stepped out of the lodges. They knew him. They called him Red Wolf, the one who walks between. He was brought to the lodge of Chief Grey Wolf. The air inside was thick with sage smoke and heat. The chief was an old man, his face a landscape of deep lines, his eyes sharp as obsidian. "You bring trouble, Red Wolf," the chief said. "The soldiers watch us. The White Town hates us. Why do you come?" "I come for the dead," Luke said. He sat cross-legged on the furs. He laid the packet of papers on the ground between them. He told them everything. He told them of the ledgers. He told them of Michael Price. He told them of Hannah, the daughter of Morning Dove, who was fighting alone in the wolf's den. "You want us to ride into that town?" a warrior named Kickingbird asked, his voice angry. "They will shoot us on sight." "They won't," Luke said. "Not if we ride in as witnesses. Not if we ride in with the truth. Silas Crow burned your kin at Painted Rock. He lied to the world and said you were the aggressors. Do you want that lie to stand forever?" The chief looked at the fire. "It is a white man's war. It is a human war," Luke said. "And if we do not fight it, he will come for this camp next." The silence stretched. Luke waited. He was asking them to risk their lives for a justice they had never received. Finally, the chief looked up. "We will not ride for the town," he said. "We will ride for the women who screamed in the fire. We will ride so the spirits can rest." Saturday night arrived with a fresh fall of snow, soft and deceptively peaceful. The big barn at the Crow Ranch was lit by 100 lanterns. The fiddle music spilled out into the night, a frantic, cheerful reel that tried to drown out the wind. Inside, the town was gathered. There was cider and roasted beef. People danced, their boots thumping on the floorboards, but the laughter was brittle. Eyes darted toward the doors. Everyone knew Silas was watching. Silas stood on a platform at the far end, holding a cup of punch, smiling his shark smile. He looked victorious. The trouble with the widow had been quieted. The half-breed was gone, likely frozen in the hills. Hannah stood near the door, holding Tommy and Emma's hands. She wore her black dress, severe and clean. She did not dance. She watched. At 9 o'clock, the heavy barn doors groaned. The music faltered. The fiddler stopped, his bow hovering over the strings. A cold wind swept through the barn, carrying the scent of pine and horses. Luke Redfern rode into the barn. He was not alone. Behind him, on painted ponies that steamed in the lantern light, rode Chief Grey Wolf and 6 Shoshone warriors. They wore their winter furs, their faces painted with the black stripes of mourning. They did not carry rifles in their hands, but they carried a weight of presence that sucked the air out of the room. Luke stopped his horse in the center of the dance floor. The crowd parted, pressing back against the walls in terrified silence. Hannah let go of the children and walked out to the center. She stood beside Luke's horse, her hand resting on his boot. She looked up at him, and for a second, a look passed between them. Fear, love, and absolute commitment. Luke dismounted. The chief dismounted beside him. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas roared, stepping down from the platform. He signaled to his men, who were reaching for their coats where their guns were hidden. "No guns," Elias the blacksmith shouted, stepping forward with a sledgehammer in his hand. "Mr." Henderson and 3 other men stepped up beside him, blocking Silas's hired hands. "We are here to talk," Luke said. His voice was calm, but it carried to the rafters. He held up the ledger. "We are here to read the names." "Silas." Silas's face went the color of old ash. "Get them out," he screamed. "They are savages. They are here to scalp you all. They are here to testify." Hannah cried out. She turned to the crowd. "Tell them." "Chief." Chief Grey Wolf stepped forward. He looked at the frightened townspeople, his gaze unyielding. "I am Grey Wolf. 4 winters ago, at the place you call Painted Rock, my sister was sleeping in her lodge. Her name was Singing Grass. Her daughter was Bluebird. They were burned alive by men riding horses with the brand of the Crow." A gasp went through the room. Luke opened the ledger. November 2nd, 1874. He read, "Payment for 20 gallons of kerosene. Signed, Silas Crow." "Lies!" Silas shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Michael Price saw it," Hannah yelled. "He tried to stop it, and that is why he is dead." Luke turned the page. August, 1876. Order to remove Michael Price. The town stared. They looked from the stoic face of the chief to the handwritten ledger in Luke's hand, and then to Silas, who was trembling with a rage that looked identical to guilt. "It is over, Silas," Marshal Diller said. Stepping out from the crowd, he looked tired. "I can't cover for you anymore. Not with half the territory watching." Silas looked around. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the people he had ruled. He saw the end of his empire. "No," he hissed. "It is not over." He grabbed a lantern from the post beside him and hurled it. It smashed against a pile of dry hay in the corner. The oil ignited instantly. A sheet of orange flame roared up the wall, catching the dry bunting and the wooden beams. "Fire!" someone screamed. Panic erupted. The crowd surged toward the doors, a screaming, shoving mass of humanity. The smoke billowed up, thick and acrid. Silas didn't run for the door. He pulled a derringer from his vest pocket and leveled it at Luke. "Die, you mongrel!" Luke saw the motion. He didn't dive away. He lunged forward. The gun cracked. Luke jerked as the bullet tore a furrow across his shoulder, but his momentum carried him. He tackled Silas, driving him back into the center of the barn. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. Silas was strong, fueled by madness. He struck Luke in the face, clawing for his eyes. Luke fought back with the cold, hard efficiency of a man who had fought for his life since he was a boy. "Get out!" Luke screamed to Hannah. Hannah didn't leave. She grabbed a chair and smashed a window, helping Elias lift children through the opening. The barn was an inferno now. The heat was searing. Above the fighters, a main support beam, eaten by the flames, groaned and cracked. Luke saw it coming. He rolled, pinning Silas down. Silas, seeing the beam, panicked. He reached into his boot for a hidden knife. He slashed at Luke, cutting his arm, then scrambled up, lunging toward Hannah, who was silhouetted in the smoke near the door. He had a second pistol, a small hideout gun. He raised it, aiming at her back. "Hannah!" Luke screamed. He threw himself at Silas. He grabbed the gun hand. They grappled, spinning in the heat. The gun went off. Silas gasped. He stumbled back, his hands clutching his chest. A bloom of red spread across his white shirt. He looked at Luke with wide, shocked eyes. The beam above gave way with a sound like a cannon shot. Luke dove to the side, covering his head. The timber crashed down. It missed Luke by inches but caught Silas across the legs, pinning him to the burning floor. The roof above began to sag. Luke struggled to get up. The smoke was blinding. He was dizzy from the blood loss. He stumbled, falling to his knees. "Luke!" It was Hannah. She had wrapped a wet horse blanket over her head and run back into the fire. She found him. She grabbed his coat. "Get up! You have to get up! I can't!" Luke coughed. "You can!" Hannah screamed. She dragged him. She used every ounce of strength in her body, pulling him across the floorboards that were beginning to char. The heat was unbearable. Hannah's dress was smoking. They reached the door just as the hayloft collapsed behind them. Hands reached in. Elias, the chief, the preacher. They grabbed Luke and Hannah and hauled them out into the snow. They tumbled onto the frozen ground, gasping, coughing up black soot. Behind them, the barn was a pillar of fire. The flames reached into the night sky, painting the snow red. The town stood in a wide circle, silent except for the roar of the fire. They watched the symbol of Silas Crow's power burn to ash. Hannah sat up, wiping soot from her face. She crawled to Luke. He was lying on his back, his chest heaving. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He reached up with a shaking, bloody hand and touched her face. "We made it," he rasped. Hannah leaned down and kissed his forehead. "We made it." The inquest was held 2 weeks later in the town meeting hall. It was a formality, but a necessary one. The evidence was undeniable. The ledgers, the confession, and the testimony of the Shoshone families painted a picture of a monster the town had called a benefactor. The verdict was unanimous. Silas Crowe was responsible for the murders at Painted Rock and the death of Michael Price. His estate was seized to pay restitution to the victims' families, both white and Shoshone. Luke stood before the council. The bandages on his shoulder were clean. Luke Redfern, the judge said, "This town owes you a debt. The charges against you are dismissed. You are a free man." Luke looked at the townspeople. They didn't cheer. They looked at him with a mixture of shame and respect. He nodded once, turned, and walked out. The spring thaw was beginning to touch the valley. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Luke was packing his saddlebags outside the livery stable. He had Ghost saddled. He checked his cinch, his movement slow and methodical. Going somewhere? He turned. Hannah stood there. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair braided but uncovered. She looked tired but radiant. "I don't know," Luke said. "California, maybe, or north to Canada." "Why?" Luke rested his hand on the saddle horn. "Hannah, the town cleared me, but they will never forget. I will always be the man who burned down the barn. I will always be half a world away from them. You need a normal life. You need peace." Hannah walked up to him. She placed her hand over his on the saddle. "I don't want peace. Luke, I want you." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "I am tired of normal." Normal was a lie. "I want to build something real." She pointed toward the north end of the valley, where the land rose toward the Shoshone camps. "There is a piece of land near the creek. It is halfway between the town and the reservation. It is good land. Elias says he will help us raise a cabin." "Us?" Luke asked, his heart hammering. "Us," Hannah said. "My siblings need a father. I need a husband, and this valley needs a family that isn't afraid to be both things at once." Luke looked at her. He looked at the town that had rejected him, and the mountains that had tried to kill him. And then he looked at the woman who had walked into fire for him. He untied his bedroll from the saddle. "It will be hard work." He said, "I am not afraid of work." Hannah smiled. "It will be a hard winter next year. I have a warm blanket," she said softly. Luke smiled. A true, open smile that took 10 years off his face. He dropped the reins. He took her face in his hands and kissed her, right there on Main Street, in front of God and everyone. Months later, the wind howled around the corners of the new cabin. It was a sturdy place, built of thick pine logs, with a stone chimney that drew well. Inside, the firelight cast a warm, golden glow. Tommy and Emma were asleep on a pallet in the corner, their breathing soft and rhythmic. On the shelf above the table sat a worn Bible and a beaded Shoshone bracelet, side by side. Hannah lay in the narrow bed, the heavy quilt pulled up to her chin. Luke blew out the lantern and climbed in beside her. The cold pressed against the walls, seeking a way in. But the chinking held. Luke settled the blankets, then turned on his side. He pulled Hannah close, his arm heavy and protective over her waist. His body was warm, solid, and real. He kissed the back of her neck, inhaling the scent of soap and wood smoke. Hannah shifted, fitting herself against him. She smiled in the dark. "Don't move," she whispered, a laugh bubbling in her voice. "You'll wake them." Luke chuckled, a low rumble against her back. "Let them sleep," he whispered. "We have time." He held her tighter beneath the heavy quilt. Outside, the Wyoming wind screamed over the plains, but inside, in the heart of the harsh land that had tried to break them, their love burned quiet and steady, a flame that would not go out. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow and the fire, and I am grateful you traveled this trail with Hannah and Luke. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. I am always amazed to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel so you don't miss the next adventure. And finally, please share your thoughts on the story in English. Did Hannah and Luke's journey resonate with you? What did you think of their choice to stay and build a bridge between two worlds? I look forward to reading your words. Until the next time, keep your fire burning.